Hey everybody, it's Joe Trippi, and welcome back to That Trippi Show with Alex Ashlow. This week, you've heard enough talking heads discuss what's going on in these races from a studio somewhere, far removed from the action. But we're at the point where looking at a poll can only tell you so much. What's happening on the ground? What are voters actually saying, and how are they turning out? For a look at what's really going on, we thought we'd bring back our friend Reed Galen, who's been working overtime with the union, traveling nonstop to the Battleground States, and has a great new podcast, The Home Front. You got to tune in and check out. We'll put that in the show notes, but you can find it anywhere where you get this podcast or your favorites. Reed, welcome.
Thanks for having me back, guys.
Alex, where should we get started, man?
Well, I think we should start before we get too far into state by state look, which is what we're really excited to talk to Reed about. Just want to have both you guys zoom out. This seems like not a ton of any kind of earth-shattering news this week, but it seems like the race is still kind of trundling along in one direction. Wanted both your takes. Reed, just overall, what are you seeing right now?
I have no idea. I've been doing this a long time. Not quite as long as Joe, but I've been doing it most of my life. And I'll tell you, I just don't, somebody asked me, what's your crystal ball saying? I said, it's cloudy with a chance of tyranny. Like, I just don't know. The problem is I think we've all been through this. The three of us have been through this for several years together now, is that objectively, there's no possible way that Donald Trump should be anywhere near the presidency. The problem is we're not in any sort of objective world. We're in a subjective world in which now, after almost a decade, and I think it's important for us to remember, we've been with this guy now almost 10 years, that he is a normal fixture in American politics, however abnormal he is. And he is being treated like voters by the media as a normal Republican candidate, even though everything he does, everything he utters, every action and reaction he has is completely antithetical to what we were used to for decades and what normal functioning democracies need to survive.
The interesting thing, like today, or I think it was today, maybe yesterday, our friend Matthew Dowd did post a thing about sort of where the more accurate polling is. He said the most accurate national poll from 2020 was TIPP, had Biden up 4. Biden won by 4.5%. That poll now has Harris up 3 as of yesterday. The most accurate poll from 2016, the Marist poll, had Clinton up 2. Clinton won the popular vote by 2.1. And that poll has Harris up 5. And he says the race has been fairly stable for 6 weeks, but the number is Trump's number around 46, whatever. And that's been stable for like the whole 10 years you've been talking about. It was 46, 46, 46. So I still feel like some of the things you and I've talked about, the Dobbs dads that we've all been working on, the Marist poll has Harris leading with that group 59-39. So that those Dobbs dads are starting to move to Harris, I think. I just don't know. I mean, are you seeing any of that on the ground, or is it just depending on where you were, did you not run into those guys, or do you think it's having any impact? Or
I think what Matthew is describing, and Matthew and I go back to, the 2000 Bush campaign together. And what I've been thinking, and we've talked about this previously, even when President Biden was still in the race pre-debate, is that on the numbers, the Democratic nominee should win. That the Democratic nominee has more voters available to them in all of these places than Donald Trump does. Also, Donald Trump's coalition is 90% white. It's smaller, it's angrier, it's more extreme. And so if you're still undecided, Joe and Alex, at this point, like, I don't know what else it is you need, right? In fact, a pollster buddy said, if there was a question you could ask, what would it be? And I said, what could possibly change your mind at this point, right? And so talking about those Dobbs dads, I mean, that's the thing that we shouldn't underestimate, is that Trump can't lose any of those guys. And this is really about the guys. He can't lose any of them, not one, because they are the basis and the backbone of his support. And as we saw in 20, in both Wisconsin and Georgia, yes, Joe Biden won, but Trump had significant undervotes in both of those places. And so I think that's one thing that's really hard, I think, to judge. The other part is, and I've heard this in places like Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, but Philadelphia as well, is that there are a lot of women in suburban, exurban, even slightly rural areas who have talked to our folks at the union, women in particular, who said, I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris, but I'm not telling anybody I'm going to do it. And in fact, now there are places around the country, guys, where people are putting stickers in the stalls of ladies' rooms that say, like, no one knows how you vote, right? From the ground, I have been in Pennsylvania. I was in some very diehard MAGA areas. And let me just tell you, in Pennsylvania, it is concentrated, guys. That is pure distilled MAGA. In North Carolina, I was in the Research Triangle, totally different story, right? Every house in the neighborhood we went to was voting for Harris and like couldn't wait. They had a plan to vote. And then, I think the outlier was just a couple of weeks ago in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I was in a very heavily African-American, tough economic neighborhood, and almost all of them are registered. Almost all of them are registered Democrats, but a couple of the folks we spoke to described the race as Kamala Harris is the lesser of two evils. They didn't like Trump in particular because he was all about his own power, but they didn't know enough about Harris and certainly didn't see her as some savior candidate, if that makes sense. It was just one more run-of-the-mill Democrat. And so I think you could take lots of different stories from those places. But if there's a concern of mine, it's that, and you guys, listen, you've lived this all your life, Joe, is that cycle in and cycle out, Democrats have to reconvince their own voters to show up, whereas Republicans, you tell them where to go and where to be, and they do it.
We'll see how that works. The early vote so far, people seem to be a lot of energy there. We'll see how that plays out. And of course, that's one of the weird things about, what you say about Republicans. You tell them where to go and they do it. A little bit of confusion there still because Trump's doing on one day, don't vote by mail, and the next day, vote, vote, vote. So we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, but look, at our own ballot measure days, right? Like confusion equals no. So from my perspective, if a Republican voter's hearing two different things about early voting, they're going with their instincts, which is President Trump told me this is crooked. I'm not doing it.
So that brings up actually one of our listener questions that I wanted to get to today. So Joe and I talked a little bit about this last week, how at this point you're starting to see real vote numbers, so you can start extrapolating certain things. But for Megan in Vegas, and I think this is a very good place to ask this question, is early voting the new polling? Like everyone is just breathlessly reporting early vote numbers, but isn't it just stealing a vote from election day? I want both of your takes on this.
Let me just, switch back to my old Republican days, which is, as you all know, it was really a lot of Republicans who did the work on early voting and vote by mail because it is a far more efficient way to get your vote out. If you can bank that vote, right, and you have a sense of, okay, I've got Joe's vote in the bank, I've got Alex's vote in the bank. That's two people I don't have to go target. I don't have to go to their doors. I don't have to call them. You multiply that by 100 or a 200,000. Right now, you can take your 4 of 4 voters off the list, some of your 3 of 4 voters off the list, and now you can get your 2 of 4 voters. So I don't think it's stealing from Election Day. I think it's giving you a sense of, we know, I assume, guys, that it's somewhere at the Harris campaign or the state-by-state efforts, they know how many votes they think they need to win. Every one of those votes that you can take off the chalkboard now, right, is one closer to saying, okay, we know what we need on Election Day. Is it closer to polling? I don't know. I mean, I don't know if we should totally revamp polling or if we should just go stand in the town square and ask people questions, Alex. It's so disparate, it's so distorted. And now we've seen, again, as it's happening again, Republican front groups are just shoving BS red wave polls into the ether just to start skewing stuff just enough for Trump to make it look like he could be winning, if that makes sense.
It isn't stealing from Election Day at all. I think it's additive. As Reed pointing out, I'm just sort of put it in a perspective. If you had 1,000 volunteers and you had 10,000 people who are your voters and 6,000 of them voted early because they're getting it, those 1,000 volunteers only have to reach 4,000 people over and over again. Like on Election Day, they're getting more of those people. As Reed said, people have only voted once in the last 4 elections or twice in the last 4 elections. Your entire volunteer base can go after those voters. Why? Because if no one had voted early, you'd have all 10,000 of those voters out there that you'd have to be. And a lot of those are people who voted for in the last 4 elections going to vote anyway. So you're wasting your not wasting your energy, but you can focus all your energy on Election Day on where you need it the most to add to the turnout. And so, no, I don't think it's stealing the vote from Election Day. It's actually adding the possibility of more people voting for Harris than necessarily would have if you had to turn out everybody on election day, which is where the sort of the Republican problem is now because of the confusion that Trump's thrown in there. And
Right. I mean, just think about Joe too. Think about the caucuses, right? How many drivers we used to have to organize, right, to get people to caucus sites because it is in person. It was you had to go to the church or the gym or wherever it was. Now those people who volunteered to drive can go pick up the lady or the gentleman who can't make it to the poll on their own. You've also said, okay, I have 100 drivers that I can get 1,000 voters to the polls. So yeah, I think it's absolutely additive.
Reed, you mentioned your travels. You've been to basically all the battleground states. I think you're going to Arizona next, if I'm not mistaken.
I was scheduled to go to Arizona, but our friend Joe Walsh from Illinois is going to go for me. But I am headed to Florida to get out the vote a little bit down there. And then I am headed to Wisconsin with our friend Trippi Olson. Then I'll be home for a day, and then I'm going back to Pennsylvania to finish out the campaign.
So based on everywhere you've been, what has surprised you so far? Anything? I know you mentioned you were in some super MAGA areas in Pennsylvania. I'm assuming that's not the only place you were, but what has surprised you so far being on the ground and actually talking to voters?
Well, let me talk about the local Democratic organizations, both in Chatham County, which is, Durham, Raleigh, North Carolina. Sue, who's this county party chair down there, is a frickin' rock star. She gets like 85% turnout out of her county year in and year out, right? Like we need to clone Sue. Same with Kim in Kent County, which is Grand Rapids, Michigan. Same thing. She wasn't even really involved in politics until 2017. And now she has really done an incredible job of organizing that county party where now they're obviously head down for this in 2024, but now they're going to go out and recruit candidates for all, I think it's 128 townships in Kent County that have been reliably Republican for decades. But as Jess Piper, who's very popular on Twitter and Substack, said about Missouri, a lot of these places aren't Republican, they're just uncontested. And so I think you're seeing a lot of the sort of green shoots of what should be a reinvigorated local Democratic Party. And then, in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania, the morning we went out, it was a Saturday, there were 100+ volunteers at the center, many of them who had come from out of state. They'd come from Jersey, they'd come from New York or Brooklyn. One lady'd come all the way from Virginia. So I think you are seeing a very excited grassroots operation on behalf of the Democratic Party, which, again, as we probably all lament, you don't get a lot of attention on that front, right? I think too often, and I will criticize our friends in the media, is that when they go to places in the States, they treat them more like anthropological experiments than they do talking to other Americans. Hello, sir, in the diner. Why are you voting for Donald Trump? As opposed to really getting out there and seeing what's going on. But again, the people, I'll just tell you this is a broader thing for our times. We at the union have these T-shirts and they say democracy defender on the front. And if someone opened the door and they saw the word democracy and they either yelled at us or slammed the door, we knew they weren't our voter. But think about that, guys, that voters who see the word democracy know we're not for Trump. I mean, there should be political science studies or books written about that very fact.
it's amazing. It's true.
And it's also a good reminder that democracy is not the state of nature either, right? It's really antithetical to nature.
This gets to another good listener question, and Joe, definitely want your take on this. This is from Chris in Madison, and I know, Reed, like you said, you're going back to Wisconsin, but I have yet to see a Trump or Trump-aligned door knocker canvasser in my neighborhood, but I see tons of Harris campaigners. If what you said in your last show is true, could Field really flip a state, especially given that I'm seeing no Republicans whatsoever out there?
I think so. Now let's zoom out for a second. It's been reported several times over the last week or 10 days that Elon Musk, who I think in the last finance report had put $75 million into a PAC, is working with Charlie Kirk of Turning Point USA and two of Ron DeSantis's top lieutenants. The Trump campaign outsourced their ground efforts to them. Now, let me ask you this, guys. If you knew that you couldn't win without a solid ground operation, would you outsource it to the likes of Elon Musk and two people who work for someone who hates you? Like, does that seem like a goon, right? A creepy goon who won't leave college girls alone? Like, none of that seems like a good idea. None of that seems strategically wise or tactically efficient.
No, and unlike the Biden-Harris effort that put this organization on the ground. I mean, they were doing it because they knew Biden would need a very strong ground operations, kind of like add to the lack of energy. I mean, they knew they had a problem there with getting people excited and getting out the vote. So they were going to build this massive organization that they spent a couple of years during his presidency to start building and laying in place. Kamala Harris inherited that. And not only that, we've talked about it. She also then immediately brought or raised $1 billion now in the last, since she got in. Obviously, there's been a flood of new energy and volunteers into that organization after she was the nominee. Put that to one side. And then what you just said about the Trump handing it over to Musk and outsourcing and et cetera, but deciding, hey, yeah, with 30 days left to go, let's build an organization out there to get out the vote. Even with all the money in the world and the best people, you can't build a presidential organization in those states in 30 days. It's not going to happen. So I think getting back to the question,
Well, I'm going to scare everyone, Joe.
yeah, no, but I mean,
And Joe, these guys are paid. A lot of these are paid canvassers too, which means you give them their $20 or their food voucher. Like, who the hell knows where they go? Like, I'm sure they're not
no,
bad people,
no.
but like, they're not dedicated to the cause, right? That's not why they're there. They're there because there was a job listing somewhere.
So,
They need some money. They're going to do it. But at the same time, like, if they go up to a house that looks a little, like, are they really going to go to that house? Or are they just going to say, not home? Right?
but to your question, Chris, can it flip a state? But particularly, look, when you look at these battleground states, when you look at Georgia being decided by 14, 16,000 votes last time, Pennsylvania decided by 44,000 or thereabouts, Arizona decided by 16,000, whatever was decided there. No, the stronger organization that can turn out 20,000, 50,000, 100,000 voters that give you an advantage on the ground, it's clear Kamala Harris has that advantage. She has the advantage in the field on the get out the vote, the early voting, organizing that now so that they know on election day where to go to get even more people out. No, I think, Chris, that difference that you're seeing, that you're not seeing Trump volunteers or supporters in the neighborhood working it, but you see tons of Harris campaigners. That tells you about that advantage. And look, she's going to win the popular vote, as Reed said. That's done. It's going to be what will make the difference in some of these very, very close battleground states because they're all going to be close, all of them. Every single one of those 7 states is going to be within a point or two. And they could all go one way or the other, but the field organization is what gives her an advantage to push each one of them over into the blue electoral college count. And it's the organization, the field organization in that tight vote was going to make a big difference.
Well, and let me just also say that, yes, it's obviously important for the very top of the ticket, but also, Joe, in some of these, and Alex, some of these targeted congressional races, right? Like, it is essential, absolutely crucial that the Democrats retake the House in 19 days, because not only do not Republicans, I mean, they've embarrassed themselves, not surprisingly, in the last 2 years, but also they take office January 3rd. The presidential certification is January 6th. If Mike Johnson is sitting in the speaker's chair, guys, like, we should not be under any illusions that it's going to go the way it's supposed to go, right? Do I think we'd see another January 6th, 2021? No, but these are learning creatures. They won't have to do that again. They'll figure out something else. So I think it's also crucial for all those down ballot races that, again, they're not going to get the 100% turnout, right? There's drop off as you go down the ballot. So every last person, whether or not it's Pennsylvania 10 or Pennsylvania 7, or obviously Nebraska 2, which is huge, right? Because of the way Nebraska does its electoral college votes, all of that stuff matters. And let me just say this, and I promise I'll stop, is that there's a part of me too that says everything old is new again. You go from state to state, you're just flooded with ads, right? And let me just say, from our Lincoln Project experience, most of these ads are really bad. They really suck, right? Like, and they're pouring millions of dollars into them. And like we've seen, I think that in especially presidential years, guys, like, I think the return on investment on broadcast television ads goes to zero sometime like 4 days after Labor Day, because people just tune them out. So getting out on the ground, getting out and talking to people, I still think there's no better way to get a human to, respond, react, or have a conversation with you than one-on-one in 3 dimensions, right? We're doing this 2-dimensionally because it's sort of become part of our time. So I think that the opportunity to get out there and do that, or text or phone call, I think is still, as inefficient as it is, I think is still more efficient and effective than a television ad.
Yeah, and you know what people forget is in 2020 we did not have that. In 2020 it was all Zooms and stuff. People weren't going door to door, and you didn't have that kind of ground game contact that Harris is going to have. All of you can make the difference in by participating, getting involved in North Carolina, Pennsylvania, whatever state you're in, getting involved and helping on election day in a house race. If you're in a state that isn't one of the battlegrounds, you can still make a very big difference by getting out there and being part of that door to door effort to one on one convince people and get them out and talk to them, which we've got to start doing anyway because this isn't going to be over on November 5th, which is a whole different problem.
No, we get to take November 6th off, and then we got to go back to work. Right.
I'm not sure we're going to get November 6th off
No,
either.
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right.
It's going to be, I think, like, I'm one of those who still thinks when we win, you know, he's going to say, go out there at 9 or 10 o'clock on November 5th, and Trump is going to declare that he won and they're going to try to steal it there overnight.
But think about that. Like, everybody's saying that now, Joe. Like, that's the thing. Everybody's like, you know, I've heard 9, I've heard 9:30, I've heard 10, I've heard 11. It's not a matter of if he's going to do it. It's what time in the evening he's going to do it, which they'll, and here, but I think this is another important part too. His people all know that's what he's going to do. And they all know it's BS, and they're okay with it. And these are people I know, right? These aren't strangers. Like, I worked with some of these people. Like, they know better, and they're like, let's see what happens.
Most of them have known better for 9 years. If they didn't know better then, they knew 5 years in. They've known the whole time.
Right. They knew after Monday with his 39-minute Andrea Bocelli sojourn. Yeah.
They knew after January 6th for sure, and they still kept doing it. But I just think that the people have to be vigilant. We win on November 5th. The days, the 76 days from November 6th to January 20th, inaugural day, are still going to be some pretty important days to continue the fight to make sure that the bullshit that he's going to be spewing, that we're defending against that. Which does get to how important the House is, because winning the House and winning the House with a solid margin of seats means that that'll be the House that will be sitting over on January 6th and making the decisions about any of the certification brouhaha that he's going to try to create. So we got a lot of work to do, but I'm feeling pretty good because of the ground game, because of where we are. And I'd much rather be us 19 days out than the Trump campaign right now, but we got a lot of work to do.
Reed, I wanted to ask about the House specifically. I mean, and we've gone into this at length, but the idea that in years past, Democrats tend to just be too focused on the national race, generally, especially the presidential, and down ballots have always suffered. Republicans have traditionally done a much better job, especially at the state and local level, but also at the congressional level. When you've been traipsing around, what have you seen in terms of enthusiasm? Is it all just Kamala, or are you seeing people really motivated to get out and make sure on the more local level what's going on?
I still think the top of the ballot drives a lot of this stuff. Look, that's not the case in, like, I think, is it Pennsylvania 7, Scott Perry, right? Who's the seditionist par excellence, right? He's in a lot of trouble. Again, Don Bacon in Nebraska 2, who I personally loathe and I think should go into retirement, is in trouble. And so I think that there are places where those things are more top of mind. I mean, I think a lot of people assume that Donald Trump will win the balance of Nebraska, even if he doesn't win the 2nd district. Although Dan Osborne is probably, might beat Deb Fisher in the U.S. Senate race there. So, like, sometimes things are a little topsy-turvy. But I think it's a broader point that you bring up, Alex, which, to Joe's idea that this isn't over, it's not over on November 5th because Trump's going to cause trouble, but it's also not over on November 5th because it's not as if the people who have spent decades and billions of dollars building out this infrastructure are just going to fold up their tents and go home. And I will tell you that, like, if there's one thing that I've seen is that, with the exception of a couple of the county chairs I've seen, like, Democrats got to get back to their roots, literally, right? Like, they got to go and start rebuilding local organizations. I think they have to restart real conversations with their communities. I think that there's a lot of these communities, as I mentioned, where it's a rough neighborhood. I can't argue with the people, and I can't blame them for believing that whoever wins an election doesn't matter in their lives. Does that make sense? Like they look out the window, their lives don't change. And I think that Republicans, we know for a fact, don't care about any of that stuff. Democrats say they care about it. They now have to start showing that they care about it, if that makes sense. And so I think there's a lot of open turf that Democrats can and must start to gobble up. Remember, in the 2000s, right, and during the Obama years, Republicans went out and gobbled up legislative seats on the cheap. We got to go get them back, but it's going to be work. It's going to be real work. It's going to be real blood, sweat, and tears and money to get some of this stuff done. Because remember that the Republicans, if Harris wins, they will start the attack on her immediately as illegitimate, on, whether or not unprepared because she's a woman, whatever the racial epithets will be because she's African American or of color. And so like they will get into the next phase of their fight. And I know, and Joe, you probably, and Alex, you guys have lamented this for decades, is like Democrats are like, okay, we won. I'll see you in 20 months. Right.
And Republicans have been relentless about election boards and school boards. And I mean, we're not talking about just the local county exec. I mean, we're like, hey, we got the House or we won the presidency or whatever, because we always been focused on the federal level stuff. And meanwhile, you're right. I mean, from the next day, they'll be out there and they're going to go. We have to start running people for the election boards and for the school boards and on up. And in these communities that, I mean, part of the problem with not delivering is that the Republicans have been so good, particularly over the time Trump's been here, of just obstructing anything you try to do for anybody. That Democrats have been out there trying to help. Look at immigration. We could have had a deal there with Langford, and no, it got stopped. But we got to deliver, and a part of that will be again winning, hopefully holding the Senate and winning the House. If we can get there, then I think, we'll have a much better chance to get some things done. But it starts with reconnecting in the communities that we've been maybe over promising and under delivering to, whether it was our fault or not. We've got to start explaining to people and connecting with them better than we have.
If you are one of those communities, like the idea of like, well, it was Republicans' fault, like if you've been a reliable Democratic constituency for 60 years, like that doesn't fly anymore. I was lucky enough to speak to not one, but two Black churches in Detroit a couple of weeks ago, and they're fired up. But like one of them said, Republicans are trying to scare the white people. Democrats are trying to scare the Black people. The problem is we don't scare so easy. So I think that it's also a reconnection of getting out of New York and Washington and LA and San Francisco and getting back into the middle of the country. My friend Lauren Windsor just put out a documentary, and the beginning of it is sort of like how we got here. And a big part of it, Joe, is, 1993, 1994 with NAFTA, where all these factory towns closed. And what was really just like this aha moment to me was those factories closed, those union jobs went away, and the Democrats went with them, right? They didn't stick around. As soon as the union piece was gone, which had been the backbone of so many big D Democratic efforts, they just abandoned not only the company abandoned the town, but the Democratic Party did too. And now you've got all these red states who, as Jess said, aren't necessarily Republican. They're just uncontested. I mean, how many states are going to pass pro-choice measures that are otherwise conservative? How many states in the past have passed minimum wage measures that say, oh, it would never pass in Nebraska, and it passes with flying colors, right? So I think that as a pro-democracy movement, we have to get back to the middle of the country.
That's what happened with Doug Jones in 2017 in Alabama. It wasn't that, Alabama had been like, a 70, 20 something state forever and was not competitive. It wasn't not competitive. It was no one had run. So you put up a solid candidate and, look, we may have started that thinking, geez, put up a solid candidate. Maybe we can get to 45 and start building something. But we actually won the damn state just by actually contesting it with a real candidate and real resources. We got to start doing that in Idaho, in Utah, I mean, everywhere. And more to the point, at the local level, and really reconnect with our base in a meaningful way when we win this thing. It's going to be, I think there's a big opportunity here to really realign things when we win in November. If we understand the moment and we sort of rededicate ourselves to these places that you're talking about, Reed. And that's really when you and I first started talking about creating the union. It was about that. It was about bringing those people all together, forget about which party or anything, but actually connect in a way that gave people a way to make a difference, but make a difference with each other and to reconnect as Americans. And I think, in Lincoln's Union, bringing it, the better, that we have more in common than we do, than that divides us. And so, I think that's what we need to do is to build the union.
And look, I mean, I'm not a Republican anymore. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not going to be a Democrat. But the Democratic Party is the only pro-democracy party we got left. And so the reason why I'm all in for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz and congressional candidates all down the line is because from my perspective, as someone who literally grew up in the Republican Party and then worked in it for the better part of 2 decades, the fastest way back to normal is to go and root out MAGA as fast as we can in as many places as we can. And I think that there are, and we see, what's her name, Glusenkamp in Washington 3, right? She beat Joe Kent in 22. She's probably going to beat him again this year, right? A normal, competent, confident Democrat will beat a MAGA nut. You know why? Because Trump's the only one where the MAGA sort of attaches its magic. The rest of them are just crazy. And a lot of otherwise normal voters would be like, I'd rather take the normal person than the crazy person. Even if I don't agree with the normal person on everything, at least I assume that they're going to go do their job day in and day out. Right. And we've seen that in places like Jacksonville, Florida, or Colorado Springs, or in some of these county races. I think last year, maybe, there was like a county auditor's race in Iowa or someplace in a county that was like 90% Republican. And also, Joe, you mentioned the school board races, the county races. Remember, this is what bench building is all about, which is somebody starts in a small city council or a county council or a county executive school board, and then they run for state leg. And like, this is not like these people don't just appear out of nowhere. They have to come from somewhere. And the best way to win in politics is to win in politics.
And that's why they have so many state houses and things like that, because that's where they focused on the Republicans, and that's why they can pass all the laws about not certifying elections and all the things that they're doing, because we got to start fighting there. But Reed, before we go, I just want a couple things. The first is, tell us a little bit about the Homefront, your podcast. Any guests? Because I really love it. I hope people will check it out and sign up for it. But I wanted you to talk a little bit about what you're doing there and who's on and those kinds of things.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks again, Alex and Joe, for having me. Yeah, so the Homefront is sort of my outlet. I've got the podcast, I've got the Substack, I've got the YouTube channel, you name it, I'm out there. And I hope you guys will check it out and subscribe at all of those places and rate 5 stars. I had Adam Kinzinger on about 10 days ago. Next week, got George Conway on. And so what I've tried to do, guys, is really focus on the pro-democracy movement, Democrats and Republicans alike, those people who are out doing the work, those people who have, like Kinzinger, right? Kinzinger's never going to be an elected Republican again, right? That time in his life is over, but he has done everything. He has put himself on the line, literally and figuratively, in the last however many years to say, this is not right. This is not okay. And so just like we did when I hosted the Lincoln Project podcast, some of the people you're going to meet on that show are not always going to be the most famous, like an Adam or a George, but they're going to be the people who are the best at what they do in the pro-democracy movement. And, it's, I'm recording 2-3 times a week, doing it from the road, doing short hits here and there. So I hope everybody will check it out. Look, I love doing it, right? I'm an audiophile, a radio guy from when I was a kid. So I hope everybody will check it out and subscribe over at Substack as well. And you can go to jointheunion.us. Guys, we have 4,000 individual volunteer opportunities around the country, most of which you don't need to leave your house for. But if you go there, you could find everything you need about if you live in, Missouri and you want to help in Pennsylvania, whether it's postcarding, phone calls, texting, you could do all that stuff. And if you live in Pennsylvania and you want to get involved, we have 2 incredible leads up there who will help get you involved. We have great state leads in all of the target states. And look, I was never a field guy. I was an advanced guy, Joe. So we never got along with the field guys. But I love it, right? I love being out there. I love seeing the energy. And I love doing the things that I think we need to reconnect the country. And I think being out on the doors is one great way to start.
So the field guys were right all along, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
yeah.
That's what we always said. Oh, they're great.
You guys, there's huge battles in presidential campaigns between the field guys and the advanced people. And so there's always an argument about who's for a report and what's going on there. And I'm glad that Reed's seen the light after all his advanced years.
I will tell you this, that I am probably the only presidential campaign advance director who ever had someone in the finance office apologize to him. So, yes.
But listen, folks, Reed joined Alex and I as one of the founders of Says Us. I mean, I'm talking early days when it was just an idea on a whiteboard he threw in with us, along with many others. But we're live now, sez.us. Please join and sign up. Look, there's going to be glitches. Any new platform will have them, but we can build this kind of community where we really have a discussion. We're trying to come together in a pro democracy, determined to have the kind of conversation, civility that are just help create a vibrant democracy instead of X and the other social networks out there with their algorithms and Elon Musk, are out there doing so much damage. So please check that out and please sign up. And look, this is all word of mouth. It's going to take people on X, if you're there, talking about Says Us, urging people to join us over there. So if you can do any of that, we'd really appreciate it. Reed, thanks for coming on the show. And thanks everyone for listening to that Trippi Show. Check out the latest from the union. Many of you should know that site by heart now at jointheunion.us. And listen to Reed's podcast, The Homefront, whenever you get your podcast. Subscribe to The Homefront and Substack. This podcast will always be free with support from our advertisers. Reed, thanks a lot for coming on today.
No, thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
See you all next week.
Resolute Square.